The phantom of the slopes. The crisp mountain air stung my cheeks as I stepped off the plane in Colorado, excitement bubbling in my chest. This was to be my first real skiing trip, a chance to escape the mundane and challenge myself on the slopes of Aspen Mountain. Little did I know that the pristine white powder would soon be stained with terror, the picturesque landscape transformed into a nightmarish hunting ground. My friends Angel, Amy, and Jessica flanked me as we collected our bags, our laughter echoing through the nearly empty airport terminal. We were young, carefree, and utterly unprepared for the horror that awaited us in the seemingly idyllic town of Snowmass. Our Airbnb was a spacious 4-bedroom house, its large deck and hot tub overlooking the breathtaking Colorado countryside. As night fell on that first evening, we ventured into town, our spirits high and our guards down. The local bar was cozy, filled with the warmth of bodies and the hazy glow of alcohol. It was the perfect start to what should have been a dream vacation. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sun glinting off the snow-capped peaks surrounding us. We made our way to the mountain, rented our gear, and hit the slopes. For my friends, it was a day of exhilaration and skill. For me, it was a humbling experience of repeated falls and bruised pride. As the day wore on, my frustration mounted. I found myself sitting on the side of a blue run, watching skiers and snowboarders of all ages glide effortlessly past me. That's when he appeared, a man who seemed as out of place on the mountain as I felt. He approached slowly, his movements awkward and jerky on his snowboard. "You okay there?" he called out, his voice carrying an undercurrent that set my nerves on edge. I nodded, hoping he'd move on. Instead, he unstrapped from his board and sat down uncomfortably close to me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as he leaned in, his breath visible in the cold air. "Not used to seeing so many pretty girls like you up here," he said, his eyes roving over me in a way that made my skin crawl. I was acutely aware of how isolated we were, how vulnerable I was in this unfamiliar terrain. I lied about having a boyfriend waiting for me, but he just laughed. "Saw you come up with all girls," he countered, his smile never reaching his eyes. Panic surged through me. He had been watching us, studying our movements. I scrambled to my feet, my earlier difficulty on the board forgotten in the face of this new threat. I flew down the mountain with a speed and skill born of pure fear, not stopping until I reached the safety of the lodge. My friends found me there, huddled at a table, my eyes darting nervously to every male figure that entered. We left soon after, the day's adventures soured by my unsettling encounter. That evening, we tried to recapture the carefree spirit of our first night. We bar hopped through the village, the alcohol flowing freely as we attempted to wash away the lingering unease. By the time we stumbled back to our Airbnb, we were pleasantly buzzed and ready to relax in the hot tub. The warm water and cool night air were a soothing balm to our tired muscles and tipsy minds. We laughed and joked, the strange man on the mountain all but forgotten. As the night wore on, we retreated one by one to our rooms, exhaustion finally overtaking us. I've always been a bit of an insomniac, so I found myself scrolling mindlessly through my phone long after the others had fallen asleep. The house was silent save for the occasional creak of settling wood until I heard it. Footsteps. Soft but unmistakable, moving through the common area. At first, I dismissed it as one of my friends getting a glass of water. But then I heard the distinct sound of my doorknob turning. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining my ears in the darkness. The door didn't open. It was locked, thank God, but I could hear someone on the other side, their breathing heavy and irregular. With trembling fingers, I sent a message to our group chat, asking if anyone was awake. No response. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my pounding heart and the occasional creak of floorboards outside my door. Unable to bear the tension any longer, I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. The footsteps had moved away, but I could hear the faint sound of another door being tried. Gathering what little courage I had, I eased my door open and peered into the darkened living room. What I saw turned my blood to ice. A tall, dark figure was moving from door to door, trying each handle in turn. It wasn't one of my friends. The build was all wrong, too large, too menacing. This was an intruder, methodically checking each room for unlocked doors. I retreated into my room, my hand clamped over my mouth to stifle any sound. With shaking hands, I dialed 911, my voice a barely audible whisper as I relayed our situation to the dispatcher. Just as I finished giving our address, I heard it, soft knocking at my door. My entire body went rigid with fear as I watched the doorknob slowly turn. When it didn't open, the knocking became more insistent, the door shuddering in its frame as someone pushed against it. "Please hurry," I whimpered into the phone, tears streaming down my face. The dispatcher's calm voice assured me help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity as I listened to the intruder's increasingly aggressive attempts to enter my room. Unable to contain my terror any longer, I screamed, "Get out of here! I'm on the phone with 911. There was a moment of terrible silence. And then a voice, low, gravelly, and terrifyingly familiar, responded. "Okay, sweetheart. See you on the slopes." It was him. The man from the mountain. He had followed us, watched us, waited for the perfect moment to strike. I heard his footsteps retreat, the front door opening and closing. But I knew this wasn't over. He was out there, waiting, planning his next move. The police arrived minutes later, sweeping the house and surrounding area. They found no sign of the intruder, but the front door had indeed been unlocked. How long had he been in the house before I heard him? What would have happened if I hadn't been awake? We spent the rest of our trip in a state of constant vigilance, jumping at every sound, suspicious of every stranger. The carefree ski vacation we had planned had been irreversibly tainted by the shadow of that night. Even now, years later, I can't look at snow-covered mountains without feeling a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature. Every ski lodge holds the potential for danger. Every friendly stranger on the slopes a possible threat. The phantom of that night in Snowmass haunts me still, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't found in nature, but in the guise of ordinary men with extraordinary darkness in their souls. So, if you find yourself on a ski trip this winter, laughing with friends as you carve through fresh powder, remember this: not everyone on the mountain is there for the thrill of the sport. Some are there to hunt, and their prey isn't found in the wilderness, but in the unsuspecting tourists who never see the danger until it's too late. The cabin in the woods. The inheritance from my father's suicide sat heavy in my bank account, a constant reminder of the void his death had left in my life. When the opportunity arose to spend a month in our family's cabin near Mount Bachelor, I seized it without hesitation. It was a chance to escape, to clear my head in the crisp Oregon air before the property was sold off, another casualty of my father's untimely demise. I quit my job, packed up my snowboarding gear, and hit the road with my loyal companion, Midnight, a black lab whose presence was more comforting than any humans could be. The drive was long, the landscape growing wilder and more isolated with each passing mile. By the time we reached the cabin, nestled deep in the pines, a sense of unease had settled over me. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of branches heavy with snow. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I spent my time alternating between shredding the nearby slopes and lounging in the cabin, Midnight always by my side. The isolation that had initially unsettled me began to feel like a balm, soothing the raw edges of my grief. But on the third day, everything changed. It started with footprints in the snow surrounding the cabin, fresh ones, despite the fact that the nearest occupied property was over a mile away. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just some hiker passing through. But deep down, I knew. Someone, or something, had been watching the cabin. That night, as I lay in bed with Midnight curled at my feet, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the roof. Midnight's ears perked up, his body tensing as he leapt from the bed and raced downstairs. My heart pounded as I followed him, grabbing a flashlight on the way. Outside, the night was ink black, the stars obscured by heavy clouds promising more snow. Midnight pulled at his leash, whining as he stared into the dense woods surrounding the property. I swept the flashlight beam across the tree line, my breath catching in my throat as I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. We retreated inside, but sleep was impossible now. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I found myself thinking of my father, of the stories he used to tell me about the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. "Don't fear the ghosts," he'd say. "Fear the living. They're the ones who can really hurt you." Hours passed, the tension mounting with each tick of the clock. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it, a soft tapping at the balcony door, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against the glass. Midnight growled low in his throat, his eyes fixed on the curtained door. The tapping continued, growing more insistent with each passing moment. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in bed, to ignore it, to wait for dawn. But a morbid curiosity took hold, driving me to my feet. With trembling hands, I parted the curtains. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. Crouched on a branch of the towering pine next to the balcony was a figure that defied description. It was vaguely humanoid, but impossibly tall and thin, its limbs elongated to grotesque proportions. Its skin was a sickly pale gray, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core, featureless save for a gaping, toothless maw that seemed to take up half its head. Our eyes met, or at least, I felt its gaze upon me, though I could discern no eyes in that nightmare visage. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other, predator and prey, separated only by a thin pane of glass. Then, with a speed and grace that shouldn't have been possible for something of its size, it began to move. Long, spidery fingers reached for the door handle, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that the flimsy lock would be no match for its strength. I ran. Grabbing Midnight's leash in one hand and my car keys in the other, I fled the cabin, not even pausing to put on shoes or a coat. The snow bit into my bare feet as I sprinted for the car, Midnight barking furiously at my side. As I fumbled with the keys, a shadow fell over me. I looked up to see the creature perched on the cabin's roof, its head cocked at an impossible angle as it watched me. Its mouth opened wider, impossibly wider, and from it came a sound that will echo in my nightmares for years to come, a high, keening wail that was part scream, part laughter. I don't remember the drive down the mountain. I came to my senses hours later, huddled in a 24-hour diner off the highway, Midnight whining softly at my feet. My hands shook as I sipped lukewarm coffee, unable to banish the image of that thing from my mind. I never returned to the cabin. I let the realtors handle the sale, making up excuses about why I couldn't be there in person. The inheritance from my father went towards therapy sessions and sleeping pills. Futile attempts to erase the memory of what I'd seen. But on dark nights, when the wind howls and the shadows seem to move of their own accord, I find myself thinking of that creature. And I wonder, is it still out there, waiting in the woods? How many other unsuspecting visitors has it terrorized? And most chillingly of all, was this the true reason for my father's suicide? Did he encounter something in those woods that drove him to that final, desperate act? I'll never know the answers to these questions. But I do know this. The next time you find yourself in a cozy cabin in the woods, enjoying the silence and solitude, remember that you may not be as alone as you think. There are things out there, ancient and hungry, that see us as nothing more than prey. And sometimes, the only warning you get is a soft tapping at your door in the dead of night. The watcher on the hill. The Vermont hillside stretched out before us, a pristine blanket of white marred only by the tracks of our makeshift ski run. It was meant to be a romantic getaway, a chance for me to teach my girlfriend Melissa the basics of snowboarding before we hit the real slopes. But as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the snow, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Our family's property sat at the top of a hill, surrounded by dense woods. The nearest neighbors were up the road, their houses hidden from view by the thick forest. It should have been peaceful, isolated. Instead, it felt exposed, vulnerable. We had been practicing on our homemade slope for hours, Melissa's determination winning out over her initial clumsiness. Her laughter echoed across the hillside as she finally managed to make it all the way down without falling. It was in that moment of joy that we heard it, a voice, unmistakably male, calling out from the woods. "Hello there!" We froze, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But all we could see was an endless expanse of snow-laden pines, their branches heavy and still in the fading light. "Is someone there?" I called back, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. No response came. Just the eerie quiet of a winter evening settling over the landscape. Unnerved, we retreated to the house, locking the doors behind us. We tried to shake off the unsettling encounter, chalking it up to an overly friendly hiker or perhaps our imaginations playing tricks on us. But as night fell, the feeling of being observed only intensified. We were sitting by the fire pit in the backyard, seeking comfort in its warmth and light, when we heard it again, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in snow, just beyond the circle of firelight. I called out once more, my voice trembling slightly. Again, no response came. Sleep that night was fitful, filled with half-formed nightmares of shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. I awoke to an empty bed, Melissa having risen before me. As I stretched and yawned, my eyes fell on the window, and the sight that greeted me there turned my blood to ice. The door to our storage shed was wide open, and I could see puffs of breath emanating from behind it, as if someone was hiding there, watching the house. My mind raced. Was it Melissa? But no. Her voice called out from downstairs, confirming my worst fears. We were not alone on this isolated hillside. I yelled out, demanding to know who was in the shed. The figure bolted, a dark shape against the white snow, disappearing into the woods before I could even get my boots on. All that remained were footprints, leading from the forest to our shed and back again. We tried to salvage the day, heading to the mountain for some real snowboarding. Melissa picked it up quickly, her earlier practice paying off. But even as we carved through fresh powder, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Those footprints, that breath in the cold air, someone had been watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, as we lay in bed trying to relax after a long day on the slopes, Melissa suddenly sat bolt upright, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Listen," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. At first, I heard nothing but the usual creaks and groans of the old house settling. But then it came again, a voice, carried on the wind, so faint I almost thought I was imagining it. "Help me." The words were drawn out, plaintive, filled with a desperation that sent chills down my